Today we're going to practice factoring quadratic equations. We're going to start with just reviewing finding the greatest common factor. So remember, when you're doing this, you're looking for something on each side of the plus or minus sign that you can factor out or divide by that number or variable. So in this case, 10x plus 25, we look at the 10 and the 25, and they're both divisible by 5, which means we can factor a 5 out of there. And so we would pull the 5 out front, make parentheses. One way to think of it is I'm doing 10 divided by 5, or 10x divided by 5, which leaves me with 2x. And the way to check it is 5 times 2x is 10x, so I know it's correct. I keep the same sign in there, and then factoring out a 5 from 25 leaves 5. And remember, conscientious students always go back and check their work. So if I were to use the distributive property, I would do 5 times 2x, which is 10x, and 5 times 5, which is 25. So I know that I've done it correctly. I can also factor out variables. So keep that in mind. Remember, it is not always just, I don't know why this isn't writing, isn't always just numbers. Sometimes I can factor out a variable. So I'm looking on both sides. This is x cubed y squared plus x to the 5th power times y. I'm looking on both sides of that plus sign. What can I factor out? First, I'm just going to look at the x's, and I have x to the 3rd and x to the 5th. So I can factor out the lowest number. So it would be x to the 3rd power. And what I have left here is just a 1. And on the other side, I would have x squared, because remember, when we multiply variables, we add their exponents. So 3 plus 2 is 5. When I look at the y's, I have a y squared and y. Remember, this is really a 1 here. We just don't write it in. And so I can factor out y to the 1st power, or just y, which leaves me with y plus, and this would just be a 1 here. So I have y plus x squared. Again, I'm very conscientious, so I'm going to check it. When I use the distributive property, I would get x cubed y squared on this side, and over here I would get x to the 5th power y. So I've done it correctly, and that's factoring this equation. If I were to ask you what is the greatest common factor, you would tell me it's x cubed y. That's the greatest common factor. Let's try one more. I guess I can just, I'm trying to look at the book. I could just make them up. If I do 12a to the 3rd b plus 4a to the 5th b squared. I'm going to first look at the numbers. And you can do it, there's different ways, whatever works for you. I like to do this just so I don't forget anything. Because the first thing I'm going to look at is I take everything one at a time, and then I write stuff down so I don't have to go back and remember what I was doing. I'm looking at the numbers, and 12 and 4, my greatest common factor is a 4. So I'm going to put a 4 out here, and then I look at what I have left. I have 4 times 3 is 12. And then 4 and 4, this would just be a 1 over here, and I don't need to write anything, so I'm going to leave it blank. Now I'm going to look at the a's. Variable a to the cube, the lowest one, is all I can pull out. So this becomes a cubed. This now over here would just be a 1, so I don't need to write it. And then here, when I factor out an a cubed, it leaves me with a to the 2nd power. Now I'm looking at my b's. I can factor out a b, which again leaves just a 1 here, and over here a b. So if I were to factor this completely, it would be 4a cubed b times the quantity 3 plus a squared b. Again, if I asked you what is the greatest common factor, your answer would be 4a cubed times b. I'm just going to now quickly review this factoring this trinomial because last week we worked on this a lot. So when I factor it, I automatically do my 2 parentheses, right? And I notice that both of my signs are going to be positive because this is positive the way through, all the way through. I know this is an x and this is an x because x times x is x squared, and that's what I'm looking for. Now my last 2 numbers, when they're multiplied together, equal this number here, 6. So what I'm doing to find out what my choices are, I only can do the factors of 6. So up here I might do 1 and 6 and 2 and 3. And now I've listed all of my factors of 6. When I'm looking at these factors, I now have to look at when I add them together, they have to equal this 3 right here. Oops, shoot. That's not going to work. I wrote down the wrong problem. This one's not factorized. Oh, boy. All right. So, forget I said that. Okay. So, I'm just going to keep going because you can tell my recorded teaching is just like at school where I make mistakes. Only this time you guys weren't able to chime in and tell me that my problem wasn't going to work. This was the correct problem I was trying to factor, so I'm just going to start over. Again, I didn't do it incorrectly. It's just that the problem, the way I had it, we were not going to be able to factor it without using the quadratic formula, which we have not learned yet. That's up and coming. I am going to go through and put in my x's and my positive signs, and then I am factoring the 6 because that was the correct way to do it. So I have 1 and 6 and 2 and 3. And then when I come over here, and this is before I had a 3x here, now I have a 5x, I'm looking for these 2 numbers that add together that equal 5. And 1 plus 6 equals 7, so that's not it. So it has to be the 2 and the 3. And it does not matter where I put the 2 and the 3. And so the factored form of this quadratic equation is the quantity x plus 2 times the quantity x plus 3. Again, if I'm very conscientious, I would go ahead and check this by using FOIL, which would give me x squared plus 3x plus 2x, which equals 5x, plus 6. So I know I factored it completely. Again, we did this last week, so this part really is just a review, and I know we did it several times. We did it last week, so we'll talk about it. If anybody has any questions, we can talk about it later. All right, continuing on with factoring, here's another equation. I have 3x cubed plus 15x squared minus 18x. When you look at this, it's a little overwhelming, and the first clue should be we are not factoring things right now. We haven't done this with this x cubed. We've only had x squared. So if I look at the equation more carefully, I can see there are x's on all sides of the plus and minus signs. That means I can factor out an x. The other thing I like to look at are the numbers, because if at all possible, it's easier to have a 1 in front of this x. And remember, I don't like to work with big numbers, so if I can make these numbers smaller, I'm going to do that. So we're going back to, I'm pulling out the greatest common factor. Looking at all sides of the plus and minus signs, I can factor out a 3. And I can factor out an x. And when I do that, I would have x squared here plus 15 divided by 3 is 5, and x squared divided by x is x. The signs are all staying the same. I'm not doing anything with those. If I factor out a 3 from 18, it's like saying 18 divided by 3. I have 6, and then x divided by x is just 1. So now I have 3x times the quantity x squared plus 5x minus 6. I'm just factoring this part right now. This has already been done. I usually circle this just so I do not forget to go back and put it in my answer. You can either rewrite it right now if you want or go back. This is just my practice, the way I've done it. If you want to rewrite it, it's fine. You just cannot forget about it because it is part of your final answer. I'm going to factor this. This looks familiar from the problem before. The only thing that we have to worry about is now we have a negative sign right here. So I'm going to write my x and my x. And when this sign is negative, that means one of my signs is positive and the other is negative. Because that's the only way to get that last number negative is by multiplying these two together. Again, I come over here and I list the factors. I have 1. I'm running out of room. I'm going to do it on the left-hand side. I have 1 and 6. And keep in mind, 1 is positive and 1 is negative. And so if I do this, that equals negative 6. I also have to consider 1 and negative 6. And then I have negative 2 and 3 and 2 and negative 3. And then I start adding them together. Well, when I look at what's going to give me 5x, it's going to be when I add 6 and negative 1 because I'm looking for it to be positive. So my 6 is going to be the positive one. The bigger one is positive. And this is going to be minus 1. And so now that is my factored form of x squared plus 5x minus 6. Keep in mind, my answer is going to be 3x times x plus 6, the quantity, times the quantity x minus 1. That's my entire answer right here. I'm sorry that it's not really showing up. It's hard to write with this stylus sometimes. Okay, so that's how you're factoring that. When you see something and you look at it and it's totally overwhelming, we have to remember to check, is there a greatest common factor that I can pull out? Is it a number? Is it a variable? And so that's what you want to do, is to break it down into something that looks like this that we definitely know how to do. I'm going to go ahead and end this session and attach a second one because I don't think I have enough time to go through the solving by grouping. The grouping is the last thing that we left off on before we stopped going to school. So I'm going to start with that because I imagine it'll take me longer than 5 minutes.